I'm Christine Yeats, Senior Vice President of the Royal Australian Historical Society. Historian Joy Hughes and I are at History House to talk about Shady Acres by Lesley Muir. This book was recently published by the Royal Australian Historical Society, or RAHS. Joy, you edited the book.
Yes, Christine. The book is Lesley's PhD thesis, which she was reworking for publication before her untimely death. I completed the editing and changed some of the pictures.
Now, I have some information on Lesley that perhaps some people may not know about. Lesley was in fact a very, very active member of the Royal Australian Historical Society for many, many years. She served on the Affiliated Societies Committee between 1985 and 2002. Lesley herself was the Senior Vice President of the RAHS until her death in 2012, and she served as a counsellor on the RAHS between 2002 and 2012. Lesley has published, or had published, quite a number of local history books: A Pictorial History of Canterbury Bankstown together with Joan Lawrence, and Canterbury's Boys, World War I and Sydney's Suburban Fringe. Lesley was committed to research and to travel, and I think it's very important to remember that Canterbury Council acknowledged her contribution in naming a park in Lesley's honour. The book, we are very pleased to say, was funded by her husband's family, Peter Madden, John Madden and Robin Carman, and we are very grateful to them for continuing the project and funding the project to bring the book to fruition. Now, Joy, how did you become involved in the project?
I first met Lesley in the old system title branch of the Land Titles Office in the early 1980s, and I also worked together with her on various projects, the local history records for the Affiliated Societies project, and also she was involved with the publication on the architect John Horbury Hunt, and Lesley contributed a chapter to that. And so we'd had a working friendship, and so just before she died, she asked her husband Brian to ask me if I would finish the project for her, and I agreed. I suppose it was because we had worked together before, and she felt that because I had a knowledge of old system title, which of course her book is largely based on, that I would be able to edit it for her.
What were some of the challenges of working on a manuscript when the author is not living?
Well, I did have Lesley's husband Brian, who was also a well-known local historian, and so I did work in consultation with Brian. Lesley's thesis, it wasn't a manuscript, it was already a thesis for which she'd been awarded her PhD, and so therefore it had passed through several examiners. So the manuscript itself, the thesis, was very readable. But in theses, the footnotes are always at the bottom of the page, and they can include really important information, sometimes amusing asides and comments. I was concerned that for the publication they would be turned into endnotes and placed at the end of the book,
where many readers could miss them.
Oh, yes. So I extracted the most interesting and informative comments, what you might say the gossip and the juicy bits, and moved them into the text. And then also, one thing with higher degree theses, candidates often include 2 or 3 lengthy quotes to support an argument. That is an accepted process. For the general reader, though, they can prove rather tedious. So in many instances, Lesley's husband Brian and I deleted the 2nd or 3rd quote, and that certainly improved the continuity. But as I said, every change I made was in consultation with Brian.
It's a very thought-provoking title, Shady Acres, Politicians, Developers and Sydney's Public Transport Scandals, 1872-1895.
And a very accurate description of the book's contents. In the 19th century, there were no political parties as we know them today. There were factions, and so favours had to be granted, or were granted, to stop politicians switching allegiances. Only cabinet ministers were paid a salary, so other members of the parliament had to be financially independent, and quite often to stay afloat, some of the politicians also became developers. And as Lesley wrote, it was not surprising that government investment was sometimes directed towards projects which would repay a favour, create a personal fortune, or shore up political support from a wavering pressure group.
Now, 1872 to 1895 does seem a very narrow time frame.
This was the period in which almost all of today's major public transport routes on the Cumberland Plain, that's the greater metropolitan area, were either built or surveyed. In the 1870s, there were ferries and horse buses, but there was no affordable public transport for workers. They were forced to live in the city to be near their place of work. It's hard to believe now that Ashfield was regarded as rural. There was only the Western train line, and the Sydney terminus at that time was at Redfern.
Well, how did the general public then get from Redfern terminus to ferries at Circular Quay?
Well, it was the horse bus or walk. The first trams were imported in 1879 to transport people from the Redfern train terminus to the huge Garden Palace exhibition in the Botanic Gardens. The trams were very popular, and Lesley's research has shown that significant decisions on transport routes or subsequent transport routes were not made by engineers but by politicians. Instead of the new trams servicing the most populous areas, one Minister for Public Works, whose horses raced at Randwick, decided on a route to the racecourse.
Lesley obviously was fascinated by the origins of Sydney's tram and train networks.
Yes, and her maps in the book show some of the circuitous routes of trams and particularly trains. They were certainly not the most logical route. And Lesley's research revealed it was not a coincidence that politicians or their relations and their developer friends owned land along these routes, especially near the stations, or train stops, which they called halts, on the Blue Mountains line near politicians' holiday homes. Lesley's massive land title search tracing this ownership along the train routes was absolutely extraordinary.
And members of many societies, I'm sure, will recall Lesley's popular talks on transport scandals and the land titles workshops that she and our President, Carol Liston, presented throughout the state. You mentioned that the book has many interesting maps.
Yes, and also subdivision plans. A lot of the maps were originally drawn by Lesley, and they show the alternate routes that were considered for the various lines. It is important, though, to impress upon book designers that maps or subdivision plans are not decorative items, but essential components of any history or local history, and they must be large enough to be easily read.
You mentioned earlier that you had changed some of the illustrations.
Yes, Lesley had not reviewed her illustrations. Many of the cartoons in her thesis, and there were many, required an intimate knowledge of 19th century politics, so only a selection was retained. And for many of the portraits and subjects, she had used newspaper engravings. Since then, the Mitchell Library at the State Library of New South Wales have acquired some fantastic photograph albums, so I substituted photographs of the same subject. And similarly, State Records at Kingswood holds the extraordinary State Rail Authority photographic archive, and I was able to include additional photographs of railway stations that Lesley had written about, and I also had found there in the same collection some fabulous photographs of the steam-driven trains.
What scandal or scandals shocked you most when you read the book?
I suppose it would have to be the totally different view of Sir Henry Parkes that Lesley presented. We know that Parkes spent most of his political life on the brink of bankruptcy, but Lesley's study of the land ownership along the Illawarra and Northern lines revealed, as she wrote, an undeniable pattern of inside information being passed from the ministry to a network of investors, at the centre of which was Henry Parkes and his need for political and financial support. And I was surprised at the intensity with which Parkes prevented the construction of the railway to Circular Quay and the Eastern Suburbs Railway. Both of those had been proposed when he was in office, but Parkes rejected them to protect the business interests of his friends and supporters and delayed their completion for almost a century, which is staggering today.
Joy, one of the things that I did notice about the book, well, as soon as I opened it, and I was delighted, that Elizabeth Farrelly has contributed the introduction. And in reading her introduction, it has confirmed that it is just the same today, the contemporary relevance of Lesley's research to what is happening in the current age.
Yes, that's undeniable.
Yeah. It seems to me, from our discussion, that this book has something for historians, people who are simply interested in the history of Sydney, and those who just like a good yarn.
Yes, there's this overarching view of the political process in the 19th century, which I said was quite different from what we know today. But there is also, as we go along each train line, there is something for the local historian to understand how their train line happened to be on that rather circuitous route. And there are these other interesting items, like Henry Parkes was in favour of the North Shore train running through to Neutral Bay. He just happened to have a subdivision there. Yes, Shady Acres has something for everyone. It's a rather rip-roaring read.
Thank you so much for coming in today to have a chat about Shady Acres. It's been a great pleasure. And I should also mention that Shady Acres is, of course, available for sale from the Royal Australian Historical Society. If you come into History House, it's $45. And if you'd like to have a copy posted out to you, if you're in Australia, it's an extra $13. Thanks again, Joy.